Hi everybody and welcome to Oregon Symphony Fanfare. I'm Murry Sidlin, resident conductor of the Oregon Symphony, and it's my pleasure through these broadcasts to introduce you to a number of the guest artists who visit the Oregon Symphony. They come from places all around the world and they lead such interesting lives that it's a wonderful opportunity for us to get to know them. Our guest today is, shall we say, a little bit on the younger side than we normally have, and that shows you something about her great talent, that she's in demand all over the world at the ripe age of 16. And her name is Han-Na Chang. She was born in Korea 16 years ago and been living in New York over the last 6 years or so.
6 years.
And this instrument that she plays is a very, very beautiful cello, and it's an old instrument too.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about it. Where did it come from and how old is it?
Well, it was made in Milan, Italy, in 1757.
Wow.
So it's pretty old.
Mm-hmm. It is. Now, Hannah, what of that instrument still remains from 1757? Because some of the things along the way people who owned it before you had to replace, of course.
Well, the back, I would say, almost everything, except for the fingerboard and the bridge and strings and
Right.
pin and the pegs.
Mm-hmm. And so actually, we're actually looking at the bulk of the instrument that we're looking at is really the original wood from 1757. Why, I know I've asked this of many of the string players who have come as soloists, and everybody has a similar and yet different answer. What makes it so attractive, to purchase an instrument from 1757? If I want to buy a car, I'm not going to go out and buy a 1900 or 1901 unless I'm a collector. But when people buy string instruments, they try to find the older instruments made by very gifted makers. What are the qualities that attract you to something old and rare like this?
Well, one of the most important thing was, of course, the sound. And the way it was made and how the varnish had settled in the wood. And the sound is just a part of the instrument, and that's, I think, what attracted me to the instrument. Normally, I would say that it takes a few hundred years for the instrument to really get into shape. Yeah.
Interesting. And so how is it that this sound could be so much better by virtue of the old instruments as opposed to new? Are there no makers today that can make a cello that sounds really gorgeous?
I think there are many wonderful makers nowadays making cellos, but the sound is not as, what shall I say, more lived in or more familiar or more warm, or it's also the secret of the varnish that all these old masters used that nobody else has been able to figure out. And I think it's just the sound.
Basically, that's
because
the
you can
thing.
have many modern instruments. If you find something really with good sound, I would go with it. And that's happened to be a very old instrument. So,
what attracted you to the cello? How long have you been playing, for example, first of all?
almost 10 years now.
10 years, so you started when you were 6.
Uh-huh.
So you probably started with a much smaller
Oh,
instrument
yes.
at first. Well, what made you wake up one day and said, cello? What attracted you?
Oh, I didn't wake up one day and say cello. No, I began on piano when I was 3 years old. And one day I told my mom that I didn't like it very much. You can imagine, I was very little, and of course I couldn't appreciate all the music that was around. So my mom, she always liked cello, and she wanted me to study, so she got me cello. And I liked it.
What did you like about it? First of all, it's a lot different than piano. Piano, you have 2 hands here. Cello, you've got 1 hand here and 1 hand here. And it's also, I think, for a little kid, kind of hard to make sure you put the bow on the same string that your fingers are on.
Well, yeah, it's a matter of practicing, but I don't know. I just thought that I was much more involved in sound making in a way, because you've got 2 hands doing different things, and later you learn about many different kinds of techniques, scales, vibratos, tenutos, spiccatos, and it was just much more fun to play with an instrument my size, with what I thought was a very friendly sound. So I just liked it more and more as the time went by.
You used a couple of words I'd like to get back to. The first word you used was vibrato. Okay. Now, when you first start playing,
Yes.
you don't use vibrato right away.
No.
Okay. So, what is the sound? Could you demonstrate the sound of no vibrato?
Well, it'd be something like this.
Okay, sort of a straight, flat sound.
Yes.
I mean, a nice, rich, full sound, but not very expressive, and just the kind of sound that tells us this is the way the cello sounds.
Right.
Okay, then you learn a technique with your left hand that says this is vibrato, and the word vibrato comes from the word vibrate.
Right.
So can you
You
demonstrate?
vibrate. And vibrato is like making colors. Gives you opportunity to paint with different colors. And of course, if you something like this. Or something like different shades.
And I noticed several things that I'd like to share with our young viewers. First of all, the sound went from being a very rich and full sound to a beautiful sound. That when you use vibrato, suddenly it becomes more personally
Yes,
expressive.
personal.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then I also noticed that on every note you played, that you can change the intensity of that vibration.
Right.
Sometimes you can vibrate slower, sometimes faster. What does that do?
That changes the color. And that's something what many people differ in using vibratos in soft passages, loud passages, strong, when you feel happy, sad. Everybody has different way of combining vibrato and the force of the right hand. And it also depends on the cello you have, what it likes, what it doesn't like, and all kinds of different chemicals working here.
It's very interesting. The way you put that was so wonderful. It also depends on the instrument, whether
Yes.
the instrument likes it too.
Right.
And now, I don't suppose you wake up in the morning and say, excuse me, I'm going to use a fast vibrato today. How do you feel about that? Now, so the instrument doesn't talk back to you, but it does respond.
Yeah, I like to say it talks back, actually.
Really?
And I'm not that polite. Excuse me. No.
You feed it 3 times a day too? No.
My cello is on a diet, by the way. But
Well, it's because of age. I mean, 757, it shouldn't eat what it used to eat. You have to be very careful.
yes, of course. Less cholesterol, less fat, some more proteins and vitamins.
Absolutely. That helps the vibrato.
But if you actually practice trying many different kinds of ways and many different, you can go like this and like this and more speed, different speed and different vibrato, then you find different kinds of sounds. And it also depends on your own personal taste, whether you like the sound or not.
Now, let me pursue this a little further because it's a
Yeah.
really interesting subject. When the music you were just demonstrating happens to be the music that you're playing here with the Oregon Symphony by a composer named Franz Joseph Haydn, whose name you now see on the screen. And he was a composer of many symphonies and many wonderful pieces of music. And also, he lived a long time ago. He was actually born before this cello was made. He was born the same year George Washington was born, 1732. And then he died in 1809 when this instrument was already close to 50 years old. So now, in that piece of music, he doesn't say, add vibrato here, or no vibrato here, put vibrato here. So
No.
he leaves a lot of this expressive
Yes.
stuff up to you, the player.
Yes, up until Debussy or that French impressionist.
Around the turn of the century.
Right. There was nothing like vibrato or anything, any indications. And it was all up to the player, actually, to convey the feelings he felt, or she felt, or I felt. So you pretty much have a lot of freedom. But then, of course, there are some people who say, well, in Baroque, Bach times, one didn't use much vibrato, and classical as well, so maybe we shouldn't use as much vibrato.
Yeah, and how do you
That's
feel
also-
about that? Obviously,
Well,
you don't
it's
feel strong about it.
all a matter of, again, personal taste. But I think that Haydn was extremely expressive person. Music was a means of expressing himself, and I think it's good or right, which doesn't sound that good, but to be expressive. So
So is it possible, therefore, let's say if you're playing with the Oregon Symphony on a Tuesday night and a Monday night and a Thursday night, that every night you might slightly change the way you use the word color, which and we know that sounds don't have colors like blue, red, and green, but they do have light, dark, and they have heavy, all kinds of colors like that. So could you possibly change the way you feel about a piece from night to night and alter?
yeah, very possibly. In fact, that happens every day, I think, to everybody. Depends on what kind of mood you're in, what you have just gone through, whether you're tired or whether you're really energetic, happy, or sad. It changes. And also it depends on the hall you're in, people you're working with, the audience. So
And
the cello, of course.
you have a name for this guy?
No, I mean, just call it JB.
JB?
JB Guadagnini, so.
Oh, good. It's the name of the maker.
Oh, yeah.
Italian instrument. Okay, you also use the word, I think it was tenuto.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the word you see in front of you now. And tenuto means notes which are sort of held out a little bit longer or somehow emphasized through a longer usage of them.
Right.
Okay, so does the composer tell you when to play tenuto?
Sometimes there may be these little lines on top of the notes that may mean tenuto. Other times it's how you feel about the phrase, how you want to phrase everything and punctuate. So it's, again, up to you to do.
What we're learning here is that a composer writes a piece of music, and there are the notes on the printed page, and very often the composer will say a little louder here, a little softer here, very soft here, pretty forceful here. But that's pretty much a guide, and then the rest of it, the stuff that's not on the printed page, that's where your imagination comes in.
And I think it's very important that artists read in between lines, because obviously a composer is not going to and cannot possibly write down everything that he's going through when, or she's going through when writing the piece. So one has to learn to use their own imagination to sort of read in between lines and see what he meant by writing this or that. So again, you can be very imaginative.
And I think that's one of the most wonderful things about being a performing artist, that now the way you play the Haydn at age 16, probably in a few years you'll play it differently and then differently. You'll constantly mature and change the way you think about these pieces. And I think it's also one of the most important things about hearing music in person, because when you buy a recording of a classical piece, it's always going to be the same. But if you go to the concert hall, you never quite know what you're going to find. Sometimes the performers work without a net, you know, and sometimes they take some pretty interesting chances and do some really interesting things. So when did you first start to think of yourself as an expressive performer? I mean, when you first started out at the age of 6, you're playing scales like everybody does. You have to learn a technique, you know. But then there comes a time when you're playing some pieces that you begin to feel something about these pieces. Do you remember when that started to happen?
Well, I think I liked cello from the beginning. The main thing that actually changed my attitude towards playing cello was, of course, very direct, one could say, experience. It was when I was 9 years old, I think, 8 and a half, 9. Yes, I saw Jacqueline Dupre playing Elgar Concerto. And I said to myself, wow, you can actually say something through music, you know? You can be extremely personal and convey your feelings to the audience. It's a wonderful thing. So I started looking at cello not as an instrument or toy, but as a person, one could say, or a friend. Or in a bigger sense, music was more like a language now to me, instead of a bunch of notes and dots and tenutos and staccatos and piano. It was more like a language where you didn't have to learn adverbs and adjectives and nouns and verbs. Come on.
All that boring
It
stuff.
was anybody could understand music, and that was one of the most wonderful things I discovered.
And also, it's a language that everybody speaks.
Yes.
In other words, it's not like learning a foreign language.
Right.
It's like the language, the universal language. It's very interesting. Also, the person you mentioned before, we should say something about that to our young listeners. A woman named Jacqueline Dupre, who very tragically died, I don't remember how many years ago now, but she died of a dread disease. And she was a great, great cellist. And the piece that she was so well known for was a cello concerto by Sir Edward Elgar, a very famous British composer. And that was her piece. As a matter of fact, there's a new film out, just came out now, called Hillary and Jackie. And Jackie refers to Jacqueline Dupre, and Hillary refers to her sister. So this new film is going to allow a lot of people to learn something about the great Jacqueline Dupre and her cello. So you were inspired. Where did you hear her play?
Well, I got a little laser disc and watching it at home. And, well, you know, Elgar, for a 9-year-old girl who doesn't know anything about Elgar to listen to Elgar, it could be boring.
Yep.
Could be. But I was just so into it with her that just opened a whole new world before me, and it was wonderful.
I think she really made that concerto into something very important.
Yeah.
I mean, and many of us who wondered about whether this was really a wonderful piece of music were persuaded by Jacqueline Dupre that it was a great piece of music, which again is one of the things that a performer can do, can't one? I mean, you can go to an audience that is skeptical, and you can say to them through your playing, I love this piece. This is a great piece, and I'm going to try to share it with you, and everybody gets very touched by it. Okay. So what about the Haydn concerto, the concerto in C major that you're playing here in Portland? What about it attracts you, makes you love it, you think that is interesting? What are some of the qualities about this piece that you find attractive?
Well, it's a very happy, if you want to call it that way, happy music. It's very light-hearted, but it could also be extremely lyrical. For example, in the second movement. I think it's very beautiful music. And it, again, is what you think of it and what you want to make out of it and what you think composer wanted it to sound like, which, again, you have to use your imagination to actually see what you would like it to sound also. And I just think it's a piece that many people could enjoy very easily.
Do you find that Haydn has a kind of a sense of humor?
Yes. And I think he knows when to be funny, when to be serious. And
Like
it's a very fun piece to play.
Now, when you mentioned the second movement, you said, very interesting, you said the first movement can be very happy, and the second movement is very lyrical. Now, the word lyrical means it has a beautiful melody, but that's not a feeling like happy is. No. So what does the lyrical feeling make you feel like when you play it?
I think it's more of a very personal, intimate kind of music where you could actually talk about something personal to you, to the audience. And now, lyrical, yes, it's singing, long lines, and within that long lines, feelings change, and it's not sad, but it's more like a very beautiful awakening feeling, if you want to put it that way.
Nicely put.
Yeah.
Could you demonstrate a little bit of this? Just give us a feeling of of this awakening you're talking about.
It's the first theme, and it's very beautiful, I think.
It is very beautiful. And it isn't sad. It
No.
is. It makes me feel as though I'm just sort of thinking about things that have happened or things that I enjoy, you know, but not in a sad way. But sometimes when you think about things that have happened that are very pleasant, but you're no longer there, that's a kind of longing. It's a kind of wishing I were there again. But it's not sadness. You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you also, I should say that almost as important as this big part of the instrument there, we haven't talked about this other thing
The
here.
bow.
This thing called the bow. Now, I mean, if you have a wonderful instrument like this
Yes.
that's capable of producing great sound, I guess it must be pretty important to find the partner here.
Yes,
Tell
very
us-
important.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, now it's again whether my cello likes the bow or not, and whether they go together or not. And there are many kinds of bows, actually, especially the French bows are very famous or well known, like Italian instruments. And I was trying many different kind of bows to, you know, try to find what actually produced this kind of sound and that kind of sound, because each bow has different kinds of sound. And
Do they come in different lengths? Slightly shorter, slightly longer?
slightly, very little, few millimeters maybe. But again, there's quarter-size bow.
Right. No, when
Yeah.
you were much younger and you had a smaller instrument.
Right.
What about the weight of the bow?
The weight also varies. Some people like heavy bows, some people like light bows. I prefer light bows.
Now, as you get older, and you may still have some growing to do, and you may get a little just heavier because you get a little taller and so forth, will that affect the bow that you use?
Probably.
And can you change this bow? In other words, can you add something on it to give it weight or take away something to make it lighter?
I don't know. Because I think it's all the weight of the wood here. So I'm assuming maybe not. But again, it's how much you put on and how much you don't put on.
So how do you know how much weight to give it? Because you can play, when you float the bow over the string, which we call flautando, you can do that and make a very light and feathery and airy sound. And then you can really dig into the instrument with that bow. In fact, would you mind demonstrating maybe something very light and floating? Just across the string, and then something a little bit heavier, and then something very heavy?
Well, something a little bit heavier. And
Or even just a note. Doesn't have to be anything you play.
Well, there's something. Look at this. This is what I call or you could call very heavy. See this? It's a very full sound, and it's again what you think this should be about. This is beginning of Saint-Saëns Concerto,
Right.
and I read in a book that Saint-Saëns had actually told Casals that he was trying to express storm, lightning. And that's a pretty much very strong feeling. And with that goes strong sound. Now something very light, could be again Haydn's second movement is very light. You know.
And you turn the bow when you play that. I mean,
Yes.
when you use the full sounding, you used all the hair of the
Right.
bow. It's straight on forward, heavy, pull it across, no holds barred, lots of your back strength and shoulder strength and all that. And then for that little thing you just played, you used much less of the bow.
Yeah. I guess it's all how much weight you want to put on it, what kind of color you want to have.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
I also notice, Han-Na, that you're balancing that bow with a lot goes into that little finger there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
I just do it. It comes naturally. I don't know why, but it just makes me easier to do what I want to do. Yes.
So of all the pieces you play for cello now, and I'm sure you love them all, but what are some of the pieces or some of the composers or some of the concertos or solo pieces that give you some of the greatest pleasure, that you think are the most adventurous, the wildest stories, or the most the most interesting, diverse character and feeling that go through them?
Well, personally, my favorite composers are Schumann and Mahler. Unfortunately, there's nothing by Mahler.
That's true.
For
Gustav
cello.
Mahler, who died in 1911, he didn't write for cello, although in the orchestra he wrote beautifully for
Yes.
cello, but he didn't write any solo pieces. But Robert Schumann did.
Yes, and Schumann Cello Concerto is one of my favorite pieces. It's one of those music where which is like everyone's favorite, and everybody has something special and personal to say about. So, I mean, many people could disagree, and many people could agree.
Of course.
That's one of the very special moments of music making, and especially with the orchestra and the conductor, and then with the audience. Bach cello suites are for, I'll say, every cellist, like a Bible. And
Now these pieces are for cello alone.
Alone.
Not one other instrument in the same room is allowed. Okay, you got to play them all by yourself. And that's like being the full orchestra all unto yourself, isn't it?
yeah, and it's more of you, who you are, instead of all these conversations with other people. And Beethoven Sonata is a wonderful example of cello and piano together as chamber music.
How many pieces do you think you know at this point that you could play in public?
I don't know exactly. I'd have to count them up.
Probably quite a number.
Yeah. It's always endless repertoire, but one thing about the cello is that it's not, the repertoire is not as big as violin or piano,
Right.
which is extremely big.
Right.
But then, of course, quality is much more important than quantity, so.
In the last movement of the Haydn Concerto you're
Yes.
playing for us now, there's a lot of technique, I mean a lot of virtuosic playing, playing that requires you to be very fast and very accurate. It's also, I think, almost very funny at times. It's very warm and lighthearted. And it really shows off, I think, your technique, and it shows off the beauty of this cello quite wonderfully. You might give us a little bit of an example of some of that? As we
Would you like to conduct?
Oh no, this is my morning off. I'll just watch.
Oh, sorry. There's This is the beginning. Very light and just playful.
It is very playful. It
Yes.
is very, very playful. Well, I think we've gotten to know a lot about your thoughts about music and music making. You have a beautiful instrument that you treat so humanly, and it is your vehicle for expressing the art of music so perfectly, so poetic, and so wonderfully. I think it's miraculous at age 16 that you have so many of these phenomenally mature and deep qualities of such great music making. And it's a pleasure to hear you with the orchestra, and because we're not hearing a 16-year-old, we're hearing a very mature artist play great music just magnificently.
Thank you.
So we are very grateful also to get to know you a little bit as a person today, Han-Na. So thank you so much for visiting.
Thank you.
Today we've been visiting with Han-Na Chang, who is the guest artist with the Oregon Symphony this week, playing the Haydn Cello Concerto. And she's told us a great deal about the instrument and about performing and about playing and her personal feelings about how music is made. We are very grateful for her visit. This is Murry Sidlin for Oregon Symphony Fanfare. Thanks so much for being with us. See you next time.